So this video is going to explore 3 ways Nintendo can maximise the lifespan of the Switch and keep the momentum right up until the sequel system paraglides from the skies. Let's start with the big pitch to new Switch owners, a price drop. In the last investors meeting, Shuntaro Furukawa said, "Currently there are no plans to reduce the price of our hardware during this fiscal year. On the other hand, while we also have no plans to raise prices, the yen continues to be weak and procurement costs remain high, so we will continue to monitor the situation carefully." But he would say that, wouldn't he? I actually love the way he pivoted here from a price drop to raising prices, a way of communicating in no uncertain terms, don't wait to buy this console, the value is there now. Switch has, astonishingly, never dropped in price over the 6 years it's been out, although inflation has gone some way to avoiding the need to do so. I for one wasn't remotely bothered by the $70 Tears of the Kingdom controversy since, quite apart from the evident value of the game which gives more quality gameplay hours relative to cost than almost any other title I can think of, $70 is actually cheaper than Breath of the Wild's launch price of $60 once you factor inflation into the proceedings. Still, basic economics is coming into play here. Nintendo has a large supply of chips and can produce Switches increasingly cheaply. Meanwhile, demand is lagging. The obvious thing to do is to drop the price to spike the demand so that it matches the supply they can produce. Consoles become cheaper to manufacture over time, so the most likely candidates for a price drop would be the OG and Lite models, giving a consistent $100 buffer between each model. I'm more sceptical of the likelihood of a price drop on the OLED because Furukawa has already mentioned that the margins on that system are lower and there is more potential for the OLED to sell even after the release of a new console, in the same way the new 3DS XL and the new 2DS XL continued after the release of the Switch. However, price drops may help sales momentum of the consoles, but what about players? Creating new games is time-consuming and expensive, and Nintendo will want to make sure that its next system lineup is incredibly strong out of the gate to maximise momentum, a lesson they surely have learnt from the 3DS and the Wii U. Given that Nintendo has resisted price drops so far and inflation projections remain uncertain, I guess I can't put the chances too high of a price cut. There is value in absolute confidence that the price that Nintendo launched at is the price they'll sell it for the foreseeable future. So I'm putting the chance of a price drop at no more than 50%. Of course, they could also drop the prices on games, with the equivalent of a Nintendo Selects line. The resilience of sales on so many of these titles perhaps makes them likely to resist this, but as we know, sales of games are dipping in line with the sales of consoles. If there was a time to make the move, it would probably be in the next 12 months. Still, I don't know that Nintendo wants their push to be around low prices. Their pitch is that they're never the cheapest, but rather they offer great value and quality and fun. In this sense, releasing definitive versions of games, including DLC, might be a better bet. Trouble is, relatively few games have substantial DLC, and so this leads us to the second thing Nintendo can do to keep momentum high on the Switch: a DLC victory lap. DLC doesn't just capitalise on the large install base of a game that exists, but it's also an excuse to advertise and push the game afresh. There are many games in the Switch's back catalogue which sold well at the time, but now have become somewhat forgotten. Here, a flurry of DLC would be a great way to remind people of some terrific games from Nintendo's library without the development costs of a new game. And because the cost of DLC is paid directly to Nintendo, the margins are much more attractive than retail content, meaning that DLC doesn't need to be quite expensive or huge selling to make some very healthy returns on investment. Mario Kart 8 will wrap its DLC this winter, and Animal Crossing seems to have hung up its hat, but I don't expect much more to be added in either of these franchises. However, there are still games that have high install bases and no DLC, and Nintendo proved through Mario Kart that waiting a long time isn't a problem for them. Games with 8-figure install bases but no meaningful DLC include Mario Party Superstars, Super Mario Odyssey, New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, and Switch Sports. I'm not saying individually that these games are likely to receive DLC after all this time, but I think there is probably a 50% chance that at least one older title, and possibly several, are given some kind of DLC expansion to bump their sales and allow them to give a victory lap boost in sales. With Switch Sport, it would be fairly easy to achieve, but the casual nature of the game might make DLC less likely to sell, and Mario Party games are usually good for a new retail release rather than DLC. But if there's more than a year to go before the next Super Mario title, dropping an extra kingdom into Super Mario Odyssey could be an interesting way to wave goodbye to the game, and you know it would sell like hotcakes. I can't believe that Nintendo don't have spare ideas and leftover concept for Odyssey, but after all this time, whatever the next Mario is, you'd expect it to have a very different engine. Having a smaller team, therefore creating a small Bowser's Fury style experience could be a good alternative to a full Odyssey sequel, and although on some level you might have expected Nintendo to release such an expansion well before now, in another sense it makes perfect logic for them to keep something big in their back pocket to help in this potentially tricky transition to a new system. And then there's the wildest one, New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. Now my expectation is that if Pikmin 4 turns out to be developed by EPD10, then we won't get a new 2D Mario because they are the same developers. But if it turns out that Pikmin 4 is helmed by an outside company like Eighting, then a new 2D Mario would be the obvious choice for this holiday. It's another one of those games like Pokemon and Zelda that will soar into the 8-figure sales category out of the gate, and the capacity of multiplayer would surely inflate sales even more, as some families will decide to get multiple copies so that children can play together on their Switch Lites without using the family television. However, if Pikmin 4 is being developed by the core EPD10 team, I could still see a sub-team working on some extra levels in the 2D space, and the obvious place to append these would be New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. It's barely older than Mario Kart 8, which also got DLC, and just like the Luigi expansion featured Luigi, I could imagine an expansion focusing on the breakout character of the Mario movie, Peach. My hunch is that Mario's demographics still skew male compared to other characters, so giving a female character a strong lead in an expansion pack might help Nintendo push the system further into a new market, namely younger girls. Of course, it doesn't have to be the megaton titles that receive DLC. Perhaps they'll feel the successful but relatively small titles could have a second wind, with a bit of an extra push. Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, WarioWare, Metroid Dread, Luigi's Mansion 3, there are so many games that could have been given substantial DLC but weren't, but could now receive it as part of a Switch victory lap before the console ends. And of course there is still more surefire DLC. We have Pokemon Scarlet and Violet DLC coming, and if Splatoon 3 is supported for as long as Splatoon 2 was, you would expect support well into 2024, and Tears of the Kingdom is just begging for a massive drop of DLC. I'm hardly the first to say it, but having a mega expansion attached to a special edition for the next console would make the world of sense. But let's look at the third thing Nintendo has up its sleeve, retail titles. Okay, sure, Nintendo are always going to produce new games, but which games? Surely AAAs are going to be off the table. Now remember how I said that DLC was promising to them because the return on investment for Nintendo was greater without the associated retail costs of producing retail titles? Well, the same applies with the eShop. There are lots of titles which could have low costs to develop, but have the potential to sell very well if the game's released via the eShop, and therefore Nintendo doesn't have to worry about splitting sales with retailers. We haven't received a Dr. Mario game, or a Mario vs Donkey Kong title, but both could have a lot of potential. Similarly, Pushmo is curious by its absence, and Pokemon isn't shy about exploring the eShop space with unusual spin-off games. Beyond that, Nintendo needs some tentpole titles that are going to deliver 8-figure sales, and at this point in the Switch's lifespan, I really think 8-figure is the target for a lot of those big releases. In the last year they had Splatoon 3, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. I'm sure they will want to keep that momentum going, but what smaller titles could do these kinds of sales? Well, another Super Mario Bros. Game certainly. A sequel to Ring Fit Adventure? Probably. Most of NT Cube's party games, but especially another Mario Party? Quite likely. A Pokemon remake? Definitely, and remember that ILCA have now taken over development of the Pokemon remakes. If 2024 has both an ILCA game in July and a game from the Arceus team at Game Freak in November, those would be two huge tentpole titles for Nintendo through 2024. Especially given how rushed recent Pokemon games have seemed, there's a risk that shoving these out of the door so early could look like a cynical cash grab again, but let's face it, nobody's ever got poor betting on the Pokemon company cutting corners for cash. Remember, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon launched on the 3DS months into the Switch's lifespan, so I'd expect the Pokemon company to similarly stick with the Switch, even if a new console hoves over the horizon. So I'm going to forecast a 50% chance that there are at least 3 more games to release on Switch that will achieve over 5 million in lifetime sales, and a 30% chance that those 3 games will achieve over 10 million in lifetime sales. Of course, there is the option that Nintendo just don't do very much. At times, Nintendo has just gone quiet. 2018 was a pretty quiet year, but it didn't faze Nintendo too much. I'm sure they would like a steady drumbeat of great releases, but they can also afford to be patient and starve their audience a little bit, knowing that there's such a deep library of games on Switch that anyone who wants to buy a new game is likely to be able to find one somewhere in the Switch's vast back catalogue.